Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's really exciting for the Friends of the Belmont Public Library to host Ted Reinstein tonight. I'm quite sure that everyone here has seen him for years and we feel like we know you, but it's really exciting to see you here at the Belmont Public Library. And I'll just give a little rundown about all the things that Ted has done. He's a journalist and reporter for Chronicle, America's longest-running locally produced TV news magazine. He often appears in the studio at the anchor desk or delivering an opinion commentary, but it's out in the field where the viewers are most familiar seeing him. I think everyone probably has their favorite piece that he's done. Mine is on Brattleboro, Vermont. That is where we have a summer home, and that was really exciting to see all the things on TV. From every corner of New England, he has found the offbeat, the unique, the moving, and the just plain memorable, all while telling the stories of the region's people and places, all of which can be found in the 2 books that he wrote that are in the back that are for sale. Ted also files a weekly report for WCVB's political roundtable show On the Record, and he is a member of the station's editorial board. He hosted the premiere season of the Discovery Channel's Popular Mechanics show, and on the HGTV network, he brought viewers up close to some of America's most iconic landmarks on lighthouses. I didn't know all about these different shows that you did. For the Travel Channel's photo adventure series, Freeze Frame, he explored Hawaii's volcanoes, the caves of Puerto Rico, and the South Pacific islands of Tahiti. So there's lots more, Ted, if we want to search for these things to see. His first book, A New England Notebook, One Reporter, 6 States, Uncommon Stories, was published in 2013. In April 2016, his second book, Wicked Pissed, New England's Most Famous Feuds, was published. He will be talking about that book tonight, and I'm very excited to introduce Ted Reinstein.
Thank you very much, Jenny. This is exciting. I mean, it's not. I've been for the last 3.5 years traveling around New England, mostly Massachusetts, and wonderful book events like this one at many libraries and other folks. But to see so many friends here tonight is really special. So thank you all for coming out. So I thought what I'd like to do is start out with a little kind of an appetizer round of some tasty finger feuds. And then and work our way up to kind of the main course, which is a really delicious dispute that has become really my favorite, not just my favorite feud, but one of my favorite stories that I had never heard of. And anybody from Connecticut here tonight? Okay, all right. So it's possible, it's possible that some of you may know this story. I did not until I started researching the book a couple of years ago, and it has now become my favorite feud that I've never heard of, and I think you will feel the same way. So the thing about feuds that I have found is that they're fascinating, right? I mean, people love feuds. Now, it has a little bit of that rubbernecking thing to it, where it's like, kind of a wreck on the highway. You can't take your eyes off. Because the thing about feuds is they're really fascinating unless they're yours. Then not so much. It's a little bit like Mel Brooks's definition of comedy and tragedy. You ever heard that? Comedy is when you slip on a banana peel. Tragedy is when I slip on a banana peel. So it's very relative with feuds. But in the book, I start at the beginning. I start at the beginning with family feuds. I mean, right at the beginning, biblically at the beginning. Cain and Abel. That was terrible. On the other hand, I have always taken great comfort in the fact that the first family, right, Adam and Eve, was dysfunctional. So I think it makes you feel like whatever happens in your family, there's plenty of precedent. Now, I could not resist a chapter in the book on it's a twofer, really, when it comes to feuds in New England. So with the battling Demoulises, you've got a family feud and a food fight. So it's kind of a feud twofer. So I want to start out with recognizing the fact that so many of these feuds that I ended up including in the book were feuds that I'm embarrassed to say I didn't even know existed. And they involve some very, very famous people right here in New England. Now, this is a little bit of a literary environment tonight. Anybody want to take a guess of who this is? Oh, show off. Very good. Very good. Very good. It is Rudyard Kipling. So Rudyard Kipling was really born in Mumbai, India. He becomes kind of the face of Victorian England, one of the iconic figures in world literature. Anybody know? You've already gone. Anybody know where Rudyard Kipling spent 3 of the most productive years of his writing life? Brattleboro. Very good. Now you're shut off. Very good. Very good. He did. He did the last 3 years of the 1800s in Brattleboro, Vermont, where Jenny Altshuler has a place. And it's a beautiful place in Brattleboro that Kipling built. He called it Nolaka, which is a Hindi word meaning gem of gems. This was meant to be Kipling's lifelong home. He was a young man when he moved there, just married, just starting a family, and he and his wife, I've been there, it's beautiful. Anybody else ever been there, to Nolaka? It's beautiful, as you know. Gorgeous house, meant to resemble kind of a ship on the rolling hills, looking out toward the hills of New Hampshire. And he would have likely spent his entire life there. That's Kipling in the study of Nolaka, and it's where he wrote arguably his most famous book, The Jungle Book. Unfortunately for Rudyard Kipling, he had a terrible falling out with his brother-in-law, which caused him no end of angst and agita and all the rest. And, if you have a family feud, and you live in Belmont, and your family feud member with whom you're feuding lives in Ohio, it may be sad, but you're not going to be at each other all the time. Unfortunately for Rudyard Kipling, his brother-in-law lived next door. That's tough. That's tough to avoid. And it drove Kipling from Vermont, never to return. The good news is Nolaka is still there, and you can rent it. And it's a gorgeous place. People rent it for a weekend. A little bit, it's kind of thing you want to do with a large family or a couple of families. Huge place. And you can sit, as I did, in Rudyard Kipling's writing chair. Or they tell me you can even bathe in the same bathtub that Rudyard Kipling bathed in. I think that's taking hero worship a little too far. But so another chapter that I had a lot of fun with because I'm exposed to a lot of food at Chronicle, as my colleague Stan Levin here, your Belmont neighbor, knows all too well. So I couldn't leave out a chapter on food. But the one I chose, in addition to the clam wars of the North Shore, is pizza. Who said they're from Connecticut here? Yeah? Pepe's or Sally's? Pepe's. Some of you are wondering what the hell are we talking about. So as it happens, I think arguably the best pizza in the world, and I'm including Italy in that, is in New Haven, Connecticut. And the story starts in the 1920s when Frank Pepe immigrates from Naples, Italy. He comes to the Italian section of New Haven, Worcester Street, and he opens Frank Pepe's Pizzeria with making the Neapolitan pizza that he grew up learning how to make in the old country. And he has a nephew named Sal Consiglio. And Sal learns how to make pizza from his Uncle Frank and decides he wants to branch out and start his own business, just like his Uncle Frank did from the bakery that he had worked in, baking bread. The only problem was that Sal Consiglio wasn't really interested in moving too far from his uncle. Same block. So Frank Pepe's you'll find today on anchoring one end of Worcester Street, and Sally's Abitz, as they say in Connecticut, is at the other end. There's Sally's son Bobby still working the original brick oven, and it is still, I think, the best pizza you can find. Now, after Family Feuds in the book, I go back to the Founding Feud, which births America, right? A war. I mean, that's really, America is founded in a feud. It doesn't get a bigger feud than a full-on war. And the thing is, here's what's funny about the Founding Feud and what it ends up morphing into, because Lexington, right, site of the Lexington Green, where the famed shot heard around the world is fired on April 19, 1775. And there's an engraving. And then the British go on to Concord and the Old North Bridge, where they're met by a far larger force. And of course, the day goes downhill very quickly. But here's the thing. Great Britain is now America's BFF over everybody, right? They are our closest ally, our closest friend in the world. You know who's still fighting the American Revolution? Concord and Lexington. To this day. This is the poster for an exhibit which you can still see at the Buckman Tavern in Lexington. which my friend Rena knows well. And they're still fighting over which town deserves the mantle of the birthplace of American liberty. Meanwhile, Great Britain looks at this and wonders, like, I thought that was over. But anyway, the other feud from that era, again, which I had no idea. It's sort of embarrassing to continually, I'll be saying this all night, that I had no idea some of these feuds existed. You know that if you, and I think most of you here are from New England, you know that the Battle of Bunker Hill was fought not on Bunker Hill, but on Breed's Hill. And of course, that battle is fought less than 2 months after the Battle of Lexington, and the British win the battle, but essentially begin to lose the war. Here's the thing. So the battle was fought on Breed's Hill, not Bunker Hill, and it has been called by many leading historians the grossest historical inaccuracy in American history. A formative battle in the country's founding, and the name is wrong, right? So Nathaniel Philbrick, I find this kind of fascinating, who's a wonderful historian. I don't know if any of you read, he's written a definitive book about the Pilgrims and the Mayflower, and he wrote 5 years ago a definitive book about the Battle of Bunker Hill, in which Nathaniel Philbrick refers to the Battle of Bunker Hill and its historical aftermath as the greatest historical error in this country's history that should always have been rectified. He called his book maybe it's me. I don't get it. But you know, the thing is, the bunkers today are an incredibly close-knit family. There's thousands of descendants. They have a very active Facebook page. They have family reunions every year. And it seems not to bother them at all that everything that has come to them has been ill-gotten. I mean, they get the monument, they get the guided missile frigate, they get the community college named after them, they get cities and towns across America. This one's in Oregon named after them. They get a drag strip in Indiana. You want crazy? They get a chili sauce. Is Bunker Hill the first thing you would think of if you were naming a chili? I mean, maybe the Alamo, you know. You know what the Breeds get? Pretty much bupkis. They get a plaque. That's not even actual size. It's bigger. The plaque is smaller. And it really bothers the descendants of the Breeds, like Jed Breed of Cambridge, 13th generation descendant of Alan Breed. And he still will tell you that he still, if he hears people talking about the Battle of Bunker Hill, he still politely corrects them. I tell you, he's lucky not to have been slugged after all this time. In the one chapter I chose on sports, I simply deferred to the rivalry, which every New Englander knows refers to the Sox-Yankees, that begins with the greatest Red Sox of all time, who becomes the greatest Yankee of all time, and it goes through the decades with DiMaggio and Ted Williams, and on into the 70s with Munson and Fisk, and it leads to the creation of the Munson-Nixon line, which is the putative boundary between Red Sox Nation and the evil empire. And it runs through Hartford, Connecticut, which is perfect because that's where our main course is going to begin, just south of Hartford, Connecticut, in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So we're going to sink our teeth into, this is delicious feud. So if you see this photograph, which has been called the most reproduced photograph in history, you're looking at what? Wright brothers. First flight, right? Yep, the early morning hours of December 17th, 1903, in Kill Devil Hills, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Orville Wright lifts into the air for about 12 seconds at a height of about 6 feet, and first flight, right? And 6 years later, the Wright brothers, photographed here on their porch in Dayton, Ohio, world famous aviation pioneers. Aviation as we know it today stems from what the Wright brothers did in Kitty Hawk. Except, they will tell you in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and now in 2016, they've been telling you in Bridgeport, Connecticut, that this might have been first flight. This might have been the first flying machine. They've been telling you that for almost 100 years. But now, in 2016, there's a lot of other people who feel that there is evidence that this man, this man may have beaten the Wright brothers into the air for the first powered, controlled, sustained, manned flight by 2 years. His name was Gustav Weiskopf. He was born in Leutershausen, Germany. He emigrates to America, changes his name to Whitehead. His first job, actually, not too far away, in Milton at the Blue Hill Weather Observatory. He was known, even as a boy in Germany, as the bird, obsessed with flight. Now, being obsessed with flight in the late 1800s is not being obsessed with airplanes, because, of course, they don't exist yet, but he was obsessed with, it meant building ever more complicated gliders. It meant building ever more complicated, large-scale kites, big enough for somebody to ride on one. And by the time you reach the late 1800s and 1900, it means one thing. It means trying to become the first in flight. Now, the first thing I found out when I researched Whitehead is that look, I speak for myself. I bet most of you will agree. The way I remember learning about the Wright brothers and the way the Wright brothers in first flight is taught is that, yeah, somebody want to get that? Is that either that or the fries are up. I don't know. But the Wright brothers were exactly how they've always been presented. There's nothing false about that. They were two brothers, bicycle builders from Dayton, Ohio. That's what they did. They built bicycles. And they became also, like Whitehead, obsessed with flying. And this was something that was a dream. This was something that had eluded humankind, right? And it was at a point in the late 1800s when technology was beginning to sort of veer toward the possibility of manned flight. And it's true that the Wright brothers went back and forth from Dayton to Kitty Hawk over 10 years. But I think we have the sense that somehow their single-minded determination, all by themselves, and then it culminates in this one morning in December 1903, and first flight happens. I refer to it as immaculate aviation. But here's the thing. It was a lot more like the space race of the 50s and 60s. There were many people who were trying to be first in flight. Their names are lost to history. And that's the way it goes. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way it goes. History records the winners, not the losers. Not unless it's a stupendous fail, like Fulton's Folly, Then generally, it just records the winners. So there's names that you've never heard, I had never heard of. But they were also racing to be first in flight. Canute, Lilienthal, Langley, and Whitehead. But the Wright brothers won, or so we always believed. But Whitehead moves to Bridgeport, and in 1901, he has already built his 21st flying machine. And this is it, the number 21. Every one of the others has crashed and burned. Number 20 went into the side of a building in a park in Pittsburgh, and he's lucky he wasn't killed. Burst into flames. So this is the 21st flying machine that Gustav Whitehead made. Now, he's holding an engine. And this is key to the race to be first in flight. Because just like with spaceflight, the key was you had to come up with a boost, right, that would break the Earth's gravitational pull. With first flight, you had to come up with a fuel for an engine. People had been able, the Wright brothers were very good at framing steel and metal, and they had been able to come up with a plane, right, a biplane that was very light. That wasn't the problem. The problem was every fuel source that had been tried was heavy, including water. This guy Langley tried to use steam power. Water's very heavy. Whitehead was an engine builder. The Wright brothers were bicycle builders. So they were great at building the frame, and they built a beautiful frame based on a bird skeleton. But they had to outsource building the engine, which was key to first flight, a manned flight. Whitehead was an engine builder. That was his genius. And he settled on a fuel source that had never been tried before, acetylene. It burns extremely hot for a short period of time, gives us an intense amount of heat and light for a short period of time, burns very quickly. But that's perfect for a flight. So he settled on this engine and acetylene. Nobody knew how it would work. And in the summer of 1901, he and his crew feel that they're ready to attempt a flight. And that's not something you would take until you were absolutely ready, because all of these guys have no money. They're working odd jobs to put all the money back into this project. If the plane cracks up, then it's another year or two. And again, this is a race now. The Wright brothers knew about Whitehead. Whitehead knows about the Wright brothers. They're racing. They're all racing to get into the air first and make this work. So summer, 1901, August. It's hot. It's hot in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And it is dawn, early dawn. His crew and Whitehead have been over the line, the city line, into Fairfield for the last week, and they've been rolling out with heavy rollers a road, dirt road, very straight part of dirt road. Unlike the Wright brothers, there's two wheels under Whitehead's number 21. Now, he plans to take off just like planes do today. He's going to taxi and take off. And he was getting press. You might wonder, how come I never heard of him? Well, again, it wasn't that people who were racing to be first in flight weren't getting a lot of media attention. They were. This was of intense fascination to the general public. So anybody who was involved in this was getting press coverage. And Whitehead did. He was on the cover of American Inventor, forerunner of Popular Mechanics in 1901. So it wasn't that he wasn't getting attention. But in August, they're ready to try this. So they have a horse-drawn cart. They cart the number 21 a few miles over the line into Fairfield. It's dark. It's about 5 o'clock in the morning. About 5:15 by the time they've powered up. There's no brakes. There's no choke. So as soon as they fueled up, the other guys run away, and Whitehead takes off. He is airborne. He's flying at a height of about 50 feet. He flies over a section of Long Island Sound. This is what it might have looked like as he flew over Long Island Sound. He came over Bridgeport, about 50 feet in the air, flew over many buildings. So, did he do it? Did he do it? Did he get between and actually before the Wright brothers? Well, if he did, this is how the numbers would stack up. So the Wright brothers flew for about, it said 18 to 21 seconds. Nobody has an exact read on that. About 6 to 8 feet in the air, about 120 feet. Whitehead would have flown for just under half an hour, 50 feet in the air. So the question was my first question, why was there no photograph? Why? You knew you were going to need that kind of proof, right? The Wright brothers, of course, they're very lucky. They had 3 people with cameras all set up. And they're very lucky that the one person, because the other 2 guys didn't get a picture. Now, eventually they would have got a picture. Whitehead never flew again. So why wasn't there a picture? Well, I think one of the keys is what Whitehead is holding in his hand. His engine is on the foreground in front. He's holding in his arms his year-old daughter, Rose. He's starting a family in Bridgeport. He's a German immigrant. Speaks almost no English. It's 1901. There is already virulent anti-German sentiment that's rising. Within just over a decade, World War I will begin in Europe. He spoke very little English, and he had what we would call today uncertain immigration status. Sound familiar? So the only thing that frightened Gustav Whitehead more than missing out on being first in flight was being deported. So he had made the calculation, I want to see if I can do this, but I don't want to attract enough attention to be sent back to Germany. So he did not want attention. It's why he did it in the dark, and that's why there's no photograph. Now, he never flew again. In short order, he had this family now to take care of, so he went back to doing the one thing that he knew he could do to support his family, which was making engines. And now, 10 years later, after the Wright brothers, commercial aviation is a going commercial concern now, and companies like Curtiss Aviation are employing Gustav Whitehead to make engines for them, which he did. He also made a prototype for a helicopter, and in 1927, he died. Almost penniless, pretty much unknown, outside of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And that might have been it. That might have been it for Gustav Whitehead. We might never have known anything about him. But this is where the Gustav Whitehead story is fascinating, because for the next 7 decades, more, right up till today, somebody comes along like clockwork almost every decade who not only becomes fascinated with the Whitehead story, but in each case, as you'll see, has a particular skill set that allows them to advance the story and also advance what we know that lends credibility to the story. And the first person who does this is an extraordinary woman named Stella Randolph. I wished I had been able to meet her because she was light years ahead of her time. In the 1930s, she's an attorney, she's a journalist, and she's a teacher. My guess is she only wanted to admit to being a teacher and an attorney. But she was a brilliant woman. She realized in hearing about the Whitehead story from her father that by the 1930s, there was something that had never been done that soon would not be able to be done, and that was there were eyewitnesses. There was no photograph, but there were dozens of eyewitnesses to Whitehead's flight that day. Both people who saw something and more people who heard something in the air. And so she went to Bridgeport and she spent several months getting signed legal testimony from these eyewitnesses. And they became the basis of the first 2 books about Gustav Whitehead, written by Stella Randolph. And now, for the first time, people outside of Connecticut are hearing about this story and the first vague counterclaim to who might have been first in flight. Again, she gets attention, too. Her story was in the 1935 edition of Popular Aviation, huge subscription. And so now, by the 1940s, the state of Connecticut is fielding questions almost daily, media queries, both from around Connecticut, New England, nationally, and all over the world. And people who are asking, what can you tell us about Gustav Whitehead? Did he fly? Didn't he fly? Give us some facts. And Connecticut had none. The plane was long gone. There were very few records. There was nothing except the eyewitness testimony that Stella Randolph had put together. And this frustrated Connecticut because they wanted to be able to say with greater certainty than they were able to, what was up with this guy? So they approached, I think reasonably, the one institution in America that was in a position in terms of its expertise to carry out an investigation over the claims of whether or not Gustav Whitehead flew, the Smithsonian Institution. And Connecticut's first request went to the Smithsonian in 1946, and the Smithsonian said no. No. We have no interest in carrying out an investigation. From everything we know, this would be without carrying out an investigation, Gustav Whitehead did not fly 2 years before the Wright brothers. Well, what you're looking at here is the Wright Flyer, the most prized possession of the Smithsonian to this day. And this is the day on which the Wright Flyer was bequeathed officially from the Wright family to the Smithsonian. This was the day it was unveiled. And this is where the story takes an interesting turn, because when the Wright family donated the Wright Flyer to the Smithsonian, they entered into an agreement, a legal agreement, which is not unusual. But from the first, there were murmurings that there was an odd clause in this agreement. But the Smithsonian denied that there was anything untoward or odd or peculiar about it. They said it was a standard legal agreement on the disposition of the Wright Flyer. Here you're looking at Stella Randolph and the next person who has come along and become obsessed with the Whitehead story. So the gentleman on the far left is a retired Air Force major named Bill O'Dwyer, who also is from Connecticut, also grew up hearing about Gustav Whitehead. He had heard about this odd agreement as well. He had a friend who was in position to find out a little something more. This is former Senator, former Governor Lowell Weicker, Republican of Connecticut, served on the Watergate Commission, you may recall. So Lowell Weicker, for most of his political life, has fielded questions about Gustav Whitehead. And like everybody else in Connecticut, has had to say simply, from everything I've read of Stella Randolph's, it certainly seems plausible, but I have nothing more definitive to tell you about it. He's also begun to hear about this weird clause. And Lowell Weicker becomes the first person to successfully, on this level of an investigation, to use what is, at this point, a relatively new piece of legislation, the Freedom of Information Act. He uses it to make public this odd clause. So this is the clause. When the Wright brothers the Wright family donated the plane, everything was pretty standard legal boilerplate, except for one clause. And this stipulated that basically the Smithsonian may never, and is hereby enjoined and blah, 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 from ever acknowledging that anyone but the Wright brothers is first in flight. If they do, we take the plane back. So now this becomes, for Connecticut, for the first time, they feel that maybe there's some sense to why the Smithsonian has steadfastly refused to investigate this claim. And the clause becomes the basis of a book that comes out in 1978 that was co-written by Stella Randolph and Major Bill O'Dwyer, called History by Contract. And it details the secret clause. Now, the Smithsonian, of course, at this point is asked to comment on it. And by now, they have built the Air and Space Museum. And the Wright Flyer, as you may know, and I've seen it, is the centerpiece of the Air and Space Museum. Still is. Their most prized possession. But they're asked about this, and their answer about the secret clause is simply, it wasn't a secret. We just hadn't been asked about it. It would have been perfectly happy to go through it. Just nobody asked. And they went on to say that there's no compelling evidence that anybody but the Wright brothers flew before the Wright brothers, period. Tom Crouch is the aviation curator emeritus at the Smithsonian. I interviewed him. He's a brilliant guy, knows more about aviation history in America than anybody on earth. The thing that jumps out in this sentence is the word evidence, because they didn't look at any evidence. To this day, they never have. But for Connecticut, this was oddly beside the point, because they felt that Tom Crouch may not be the best person to have been refusing to investigate the claim that they've been asking the Smithsonian to carry out for 45 years. Tom Crouch is born in Dayton, Ohio. Not in itself disqualifying. What bothers Connecticut more is that he was also the first official biographer of the Wright brothers. Yeah. So Connecticut felt maybe it would have been good for you to recuse yourself from. So we get to the 1980s, and the next person who becomes obsessed with the Whitehead story and also has a skill set that allows him to do something significant. So Andy Koch is a fascinating guy. He's a world-class adventurer. He's hiked mountains all over the world, scuba dived, parachuted all over the world. He's also a wonderful teacher, still teaching today in his late 70s in Fairfield, Connecticut. Also a master craftsman. So in the early 1980s, he goes to a lecture given by Bill O'Dwyer about Whitehead. And he goes up to him at the end of the lecture and he says, look, I know that the number 21 doesn't exist anymore, but what if we could fly an authentic replica? Wouldn't we get a better sense of how airworthy it might have been? And O'Dwyer says, well, that'd be great, but we don't have a replica. And Koch says, well, I'm going to build one. So he spends the next 3 years building, and when I say painstakingly recreated, down to the width of the almost microscopic thread that was used in the white muslin that forms the fuselage of the number 21 from the same village in India, near Madras, where Whitehead had gotten the white muslin from. So he builds first a 3/8 replica, and it passes muster by the aviation engineers at Sikorsky Aviation, who are looking at it with him here. And then he builds a full-size replica. And then he's going to fly it. Now, Andy Koch was not a pilot. And when Gustav Whitehead flew, he didn't need a pilot's license, mainly because there was no such thing as a pilot. So, but now in 1986 in Connecticut, you need a pilot's license to fly something like this. So Andy Koch spends $5,000 of his own money, and he becomes a pilot. Now, when I interviewed Andy, I said to him, with a certain amount of, journalist skepticism, but I said, look, nobody doubts that what you created was a slavishly recreated, painstakingly recreated replica. There's no question. But I said, there are so many other variables that we don't know about. We don't know, for instance, we know that it was, summer and it was clear the day that Whitehead flew in 1901, but we don't know anything about crosswinds that day and how it might have favored you in 1986. And he said, listen, all I can tell you is this. We made it as hard for ourselves and as hard for this thing to fly as we could. So Whitehead originally, fully fueled up with him in it, it weighed 201 pounds. Andy Koch, small guy. When they were finished, it weighed 197 pounds. So lighter than Whitehead. Now, they didn't want to be accused of, now it was easier for them, so they threw in a 100-pound sandbag. And he said, all I can tell you is that when we were about to take off, he said, I powered up. They moved the chocks away from the wheels. I started to roll. He had turned to put his hand on the side of the fuselage to look behind him, and he said, my watch fell off. Now, the watch was no ordinary watch. The watch had an altimeter on it, which was key to being able to validate getting up to 50 feet. So he said, the watch fell off. I'm looking for the watch, and as I'm looking, I think the only thing worse than not being able to know my altitude is if this thing veers off the runway and cracks up. So he said, I brought myself into my upright position, and I was already 35 feet off the ground. He said all that thing wanted to do was get into the air. And it did. And he flew it. Whitehead flew for just under half an hour. So for good measure, Andy Koch flew for an hour and 5 minutes until he was just about run out of acetylene fuel. He landed, got a hero's welcome in Bridgeport, and now the story gets wider media attention. So 60 Minutes did a piece in 1987 with the right's wrong. And now comes the last person who takes us up to the present day, who lends their particular expertise to advancing this story. Now, John Brown had never heard of Gustav Whitehead. I'm not sure he ever heard of Connecticut, but he had a good excuse. He grew up in Melbourne, Australia. And in a bizarre irony, in the early 2000s, John Brown, who is an aviation, not only an aviation curator, he's an aviation investigator. So this is what he does. He investigates various aviation phenomena. The Smithsonian Institution in the early 2000s hired John Brown to produce a series of television pieces about American aviation history. He's hired by Tom Crouch, who will regret this the rest of his life. Because John Brown has basically made the last 10 years of Tom Crouch's life a living hell. So the first thing that John Brown does, he comes over, he has a meeting at the Smithsonian with Tom Crouch. And at this point, John Brown, who I've talked to several times, brilliant guy, photographic memory, which will come in handy, he probably knows almost as much as Tom Crouch about American aviation history. So they have a meeting at the Smithsonian. And when they're all done, he turns to Tom Crouch and he says, hey, what do you know, Tom, about this Gustav Whitehead fellow? And Tom Crouch says, immediately, you know he didn't fly, right? John Brown is not just an aviation curator, he's an investigator. He's been a detective. So to him, what Tom Crouch has just said is what a detective would call a tell. He's just volunteered something that wasn't asked. And to him, it made him immediately think one thing. I think Gustav Whitehead might have flown. So he sets himself for the next year of his life investigating like no one ever has Gustav Whitehead. And he comes up with results almost immediately. He finds something that people had been told didn't exist. He found a contemporaneous newspaper account next day, Bridgeport Herald, of Gustav Whitehead having flown over Bridgeport. Then he goes over to Leutershausen, Germany. He spends 2 months in Whitehead's hometown, spends about a week combing through the attic of the Whitehead Museum, and he finds this photograph. Now, he was looking at this photograph, but that little circle of red is what caught his eye. So he went to the local police station. He asked them if they could blow up that photograph. They did, almost 300 times. And now John Brown, because again, he has digested every single piece of eyewitness testimony that Stella Randolph recorded. And one of them was of a custodian of a bank who was on his way to work early in the morning, that morning. And the sun was just coming up, and it was light enough for him to have said two things. First, he thought he heard a lawnmower in the sky, which is exactly what it would have sounded like. And think how weird that must have been, because at that time, you didn't hear noises in the sky. So he thought he heard a lawnmower in the sky. And then he said, as he turned to his building, the bank building, he thought he saw someone on the roof with a camera on a tripod. And what John Brown thought he might be looking at is number 21 as it landed on a vacant lot on Pine Street just across from that bank. The Smithsonian calls this photograph the smudge. And John Brown doesn't consider it a smoking gun, but it begins to add to the circumstantial evidence. So now John Brown goes around speaking about Gustav Whitehead. He doesn't say that he's first in flight. He said there is much more to the flight, the race to be first in flight than we ever knew. That's his point. And his Exhibit A is Gustav Whitehead. So now the story gets more attention again. And in 2013, John Brown has a fateful meeting with the editorial staff of Jane's All the World's Aircraft, which is considered to be sort of the Bible of aviation. He meets with them in Frankfurt, Germany, where there's an air show. He meets with them for about an hour and a half, presents everything that he has found. He's trying to get some sort of reality check on what aviation experts think about this. And in 3 months after that, Jane's puts out its centennial edition in 2013. Inside the front cover, there is an announcement to their readers that they now believe that there is a very good chance that Gustav Whitehead, not the Wright brothers, was first in flight. That's all Connecticut had to hear. So this elevates their feud with North Carolina to whole new levels. And in June 2013, the Connecticut legislature passes a bill with no dissenting votes. Try doing that anywhere today. And Connecticut becomes the only state in America that recognizes someone other than the Wright brothers as first in flight. Does it change anything? I don't think so. I think that the Wright brothers have the photograph, and Whitehead didn't, and that's the ball game. That's the ball game. If you go to Kitty Hawk today, if you have, you know that there's a beautiful national park property there with this stunning, soaring monument to the Wright brothers. If you go to Bridgeport, and there's so much. All I can tell you, if you want to see the Whitehead Monument in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and you reach this intersection, pray for a red light. So it goes by very, very fast. It took them a year and a half just to come up with the money for the inscription on the bottom. But Connecticut will tell you, this is a bumper sticker you might see sometime, but this is the license plate that Connecticut firmly believes that North Carolina should have. And that's the Whitehead story. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, I like to ask when I tell the story. So, how many people had ever heard of Gustav Weiskopf? Nobody. Yeah, I had neither. So we're one in ignorance on that. How many people think that, based on what you've heard about Gustav Weiskopf, that there is some credibility, no credibility, doesn't change your mind at all about First in Flight? Who thinks that you consider it in a new way now? Yeah. Well, that's how I felt. I mean, that's how I feel, but I don't feel that it will change. I don't, you know what? I disagree with James in that I don't think it should change, because I think that the Wright brothers have the photograph, and that's the breaks. You know, that's the breaks. But thank you very much for sitting through that. The food was more fun. Any questions? I'd be happy to take any question. Doesn't have to be about feuds. God knows we've talked about Whitehead enough. But any questions at all? It could be about anything. Yeah.
I was just curious, did David McCullough mention Whitehead in his book, The Wright Brothers, that just recently came out? I read it, but I don't remember.
I'm so glad you asked. He does! Let me read that to you, because it's very, very brief, which is part of what many people wonder about. One paragraph. This is David McCullough. Of further aggravation are stories of others who had supposedly achieved flight before the Wrights, the most annoying being that of a German-American named Gustav Weiskopf, who was said to have flown a plane of his own in Connecticut in 1901 and 1902. The story was entirely without evidence and wholly untrue, but keeps drawing attention as the years pass. I have the world of respect for David McCullough. I do. I've read, I think, almost everything he's written. I have the world of respect for him. However, I find it, that's fine if you want to lay out the case that you don't think there's anything to it. But to dismiss the evidence that has been amassed as wholly without evidence, I just, what do you think? It was your question.
I read the book and I don't remember the...
Yeah. Well, you can see how quickly it went by. Yeah, listen, if you Google Gustav Weiskopf, be prepared to have a little time on your hands, because you'll go down a rabbit hole. And 37 links and 2.5 hours later, it is a white-hot dispute between those who feel affronted by Gustav Whitehead's legacy, that it's somehow besmirching the Wright brothers, which nobody means for it to do. Nobody makes the case that the Wright brothers do not deserve all the fame, the hero status that they have. No, the only question is whether or not they were first. Other than that, aviation as we know it today goes directly to the Wright brothers. Actually, not Whitehead. But I just think that, there are those, it gets all grassy knoll-ish. There are actually some people who believe that the Wright brothers, because this was coming to a head in 2013, the Whitehead stuff, there are some who think that the Wright family contracted with David McCullough to write this book. Now, I don't want to get all grassy knoll like that, like there was a second writer in the thing, but. Anyway, I'm glad you asked. I got tired of people asking that, and I had the book at home, so this is the first time I brought it with me. Thank you. Anyone else? Any non-Whitehead question? Well, thank you very much. Thank you.